Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today's online presentation that will be about tips and tricks for bringing actionable IP intelligence into the boardroom. My name is Anne Leternier, and I am a business development manager in LexisNexis IP in Europe. I would like to introduce our panelists. We have today the pleasure to welcome Laura Gisler. I don't know if we can see her now, but she's there, that's for sure.
I'm here, sorry, Anne, having some trouble with my webcam.
No problem. The most important is your voice. So Laura is working as the head of IP at Polestar. As you may or may not know, Polestar is a manufacturer of electric cars, and it's part of the Geely Group, who also owns Volvo. Actually, Laura is based in Gothenburg in Sweden, where she moved to join Volvo Car Group as IP Counsel, focusing on tech IP issues. And before that, she used to be a patent attorney at IBM in the US. We also have the pleasure to welcome Brian Hinman, who is Chief Innovation Officer at AON. He holds an MBA in Strategic Management. And before joining AON in 2018, Brian was SIPO at Philips, and he had also been VP of Intellectual Property and Licensing at Digital Communications. I also have the pleasure to welcome one of my colleagues, Megan McLaughlin, who is now leading the product management team for our prosecution product, Patent Advisor and Patent Optimizer. After graduating from Harvard Law School, she worked as a patent attorney at Nurture, McLagan and Fish, and her technical focus reached into a variety of industries such as medical devices, the food industry, software, printers, and biotech. So thank you very much to the three of you to share with us today some of your best tips to understand what the executives in the boardroom are expecting, become more audible, and in the end, get what you want from them for your department and for your company. And last but certainly not least, we have Jean Quinn. Everybody knows Jean, of course. Is the founder of IP Watchdog, a patent attorney, a law professor, and a leading critic on patent law and innovation policy. And Jean has been named one of the world's leading IP strategists by IM Magazine. So thanks again, everyone, for attending today's presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to Jean.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us here today for this discussion. If at any point in time during the conversation you guys have a question, please feel free to use the question tab on the GoToWebinar control panel. And you can also access the slides that we've put together for you on the GoToWebinar control panel as well by clicking the handouts tab, and it's right there. You can download it onto your desktop, onto your laptop right now, right here today, if you'd like those as well. So thank you for joining us at this special time. Normally we do these at noon. Today we're doing it at 9 a.m., trying to make it a little bit more convenient for the European market and see how that goes. Hopefully this is a convenient time for you. We'll see if it is. Please let us know. We'll have a survey at the end and give us your thoughts. We always are happy to hear what you have to say. This is the discussion agenda. You've all seen this already. So there's no need to belabor this slide in particular, but I'd like to pause here and for the first time bring in our panelists and get their thoughts on what it is that we're going to talk about here today, which is really IP at the C-suite level and IP in the boardroom. And let's start with Brian, if we can. Brian, this is a topic that when we were kicking around doing the topic, I really wanted to get you on this call because in addition to where you are now at Aon, and everybody in the industry probably knows Aon, and everybody probably knows your background too, but you spent over a decade in charge of IBM's intellectual property, and you were held the same title of VP of IP and licensing at Verizon and InterDigital, and you founded Unified Patents or co-founded with Sean, and you've seen this from so many different angles, and you've been in boardrooms for a generation. So I really needed you to be on this call. And whenever we talk about this, we always talk about getting your message across in a way that you can be heard. And I really want to start there if we can. When you think about this big, broad topic, what do you want people to think about to lay the foundation for the discussion today?
Yeah, I think it's easy, first of all, for a C-suite or a board to get lost in analytics, right? So you don't want to bombard them with a lot of statistics that really either float over their heads or aren't directly relevant to what their perspective is. And so you have to make the analytics and the supporting information relevant to that, right? So if it's a CFO, you make then you focus on things that are important to him, either cost cutting, or you're focused on perhaps looking at R&D investment and extending the yield that you're getting from that. So looking at, I'm not just getting patents and trademarks and know-how and trade secrets. You want to make sure that you're getting the right yield from that, so that way you're getting a return on the investment. So that gets his attention. Or perhaps licensing, if you want, if that's your chosen IP strategy, then you want to focus on how much money can we bring in this quarter or next year. And so that's his perspective. At GC, then you want to make sure that you're focusing on risk mitigation, looking at the litigation posturing, looking at the industry. What is everybody else doing? How's that affecting me? And how can that put me in a detrimental place from a legal perspective? If it's the CEO himself, then you're looking holistically on the program, and you're really focusing on everything that would affect him from every business unit that's on the planet for that total enterprise. And so you want to make sure that you have your hands on the IP strategy for the entire organization and how it affects him. So just make it relevant. Okay, great.
That's a good place to start. Now, Laura, bringing you into the conversation here now and get your big, broad take. And those who may not be familiar with Polestar, I guess it would be correct to call it a spin-off of Volvo. Is that right? Maybe we start there.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Gene. And well, first of all, I'm going to send you a picture because I've got a nice Scandinavian background. I was so excited for everyone to see. So I'll send you that after. Okay. But back to the topic at hand. So Polestar used to be part of Volvo Cars, and they spun it out, and now it's half owned by Volvo Cars and half owned by Geely right now. So separate legal entity, but still a strategic affiliate. The performance electric kind of nameplate of Volvo Cars was where it started, and now spun out entirely and working on building our own brand and reputation, and of course IP portfolio with all of that.
And you have, in doing that, I suppose, an awful lot of different constituencies that you need to give different information to in what up until recently has been a mature marketplace.
Yeah, and I think Brian overviewed it masterfully, that tailoring the message, right? And whether that's the whomever that is in the management team, or even the various other stakeholders, as a company is evolving and growing, you have the folks who are officially making the decision, right? And then you a lot of times also have some other folks that are more on the grounds really executing those decisions, and you need to get them on board. So I think, I won't add too much more to what Brian said from the overview perspective of tailoring the message, making it relevant, and then also what I see is really connecting and seeing the long game and the relationship building. So really a nice combination of the the data sets and the various relevant data who you're speaking to, combined with, hey, we're talking to people here. So figuring out how to build those relationships and then foster them.
Okay, great. We're going to come back to that here quickly in a minute. But Megan, your preliminary thoughts on this as the data geek here, I suppose, right? I mean, look at the facts here. I mean, there is a staggering amount of data that is available, and it could just become overload.
Yeah, absolutely. And so disclaimer, I've never presented patent data in the boardroom, but as part of my job, I've worked with, hundreds of customers who work for large companies, and I've helped them to work to create the data that they are going to present in the boardroom. And absolutely, I mean, both Brian and Laura hit the nail on the head with patent data is overwhelming. And I think a lot of people who aren't attorneys are going to be intimidated by it. You even say those words, and I think there's a yawn because they expect you're going to hit them with a spreadsheet or, God forbid, a claim chart. And so it really, the key is finding a way to express the value to them. Because I think the other issue that we see a lot in corporations is that a lot of people outside the patent group view patents as a line item and expense. They are expensive, and everybody sees that. And so, two of the keys that I've discovered through working with our customers are, one, showing that you are working to reduce the unnecessary expense, and two, showing the value of the asset in terms that they will understand. So if it's a CFO, in terms of dollars, just like Brian was saying.
Yeah.
But the good news is we have worked really hard. There really are ways to express the value of this data now.
And it's getting better, thank goodness. Otherwise, it would just be impossible to make any sense out of the data that's out there. All right, so let's get going with the substance here, and we've labeled this tips and tricks for bringing IP intelligence into the boardroom. And I think from my perspective, the big thing to understand here is the tip and the trick is there is no tip and there is no trick other than remembering what the first thing here on Laura's slide is people are people, really, right, Laura? I mean, when it comes right down to it, it's about people and conveying information and relationships, right?
Yeah, definitely. Can I just jump into this then?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly what you were saying, Jean. And hopefully I'm planning to get to more, I think, tangible, concrete takeaways. But for me, even more than a preface, it just seems like necessary context in any of these conversations to remind folks, and especially always remind myself that we're working with humans. I think I've worked in a lot of different spaces doing some advocacy work, some activism work, some art spaces, some nonprofit boards, right? And like in all of these spaces, it turns out, in my experience so far, corporate boardrooms in some ways are no different. We're still working with humans who have unique personalities and unique preferences and unique interests. So for me, I think before I approach any of these conversations, be they the formal pitches with a deck where you're trying to make a point, or just the more casual interactions or the touch points that you're having with folks trying to build momentum, keeping that in mind is something that has really benefited me, and I think brings a little bit of life and heart to the work, and also makes it fun. And I think with folks always have, and probably everyone on this call, you always have plenty to do and plenty of people to talk to and respond to. And the more I think pleasant or just informed the interaction can be, the more likely you are that folks will actually get back to you. So I don't know if that's maybe should have
and the reason why
record comment.
No, and the reason why I started there too and said that there's no real tip or trick is that, and we're going to get to some substantive stuff. We have a slide here where we're going to go through the questions that we've teed up, and we're going to give you some real insights and stuff like that. But a lot of times people are looking for the nugget in like, oh, that's the real wisdom. Well, the real wisdom here, I think, is, don't don't look past the obvious, right? You know, and the one thing that that your boss, Ray Millian, who I know so well, always tells me, you know, when his job is just working with people, you know, is to communicate information to people, to deal with people, whether it's dealing with, you know, the secretary who has had a tragedy at home that needs somebody to just listen for a minute while she vents, or, you know, or you're dealing with somebody in the boardroom who really wants to understand but doesn't have the background to understand, based on their, you know, where they're at, because maybe they're new to the board or something like that. You know, you have to understand where people are, you know, and you work with them. And there's no magic to that, but if you're a real person and you're a genuine person, and they want to go to you and they want to talk to you, your career becomes not limited. Whereas if you are your typical, prototypical maybe, or maybe your Dilbert type attorney, right? Nobody wants to talk to you, and then your career does become very limited, right?
Yeah, Jean, and I think also for me, I mean, exactly that. And I also see that in for me at least, some tendencies that I have when I'm working specifically with data and really trying to sell a point, and this is kind of now going into point 2. I'm just casually talking over these points. I hope that's okay.
Oh, no,
Feel free
that's
to add more
perfect.
structure if we need it. But and Brian and Megan, please jump in here with your thoughts. But for me, when I'm working with data or really trying to convince folks, right, and you're trying to build credibility and establish your authority on a subject, I think that's one tone, but really being intentional and balancing that out with the relationship piece. And that's where checking your ego at the door, for me, is something that's always been very helpful, because I think it takes a very confident person and combined with a very rare personality to be excited to talk openly with a group of peers about something they know very little about, right? Yeah. And so in order to engage these folks about something that you are necessarily educating while also instructing them in, I think finding where they are at in terms of they being either the CFO or the CEO. Our CEO is a designer, and so is very familiar with some parts of IP and less familiar with other parts. So trying to establish just that allyship, right? And figuring out what level to speak with them at in your area of expertise, and then growing from there has been a game changer for me. After, unfortunately, I think I learned the hard way coming in with all of my prepared data, which I was so excited about, and really, you know, sold the point blank, made the point for me rather, and then realizing that that there are many different approaches that could be much more helpful here.
Right. So you need the data, and you have to have it at the ready. But it's not necessarily, you're not going to get in the boardroom the opportunity to go through a 30-minute presentation.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So Brian, I want to bring you in here, because one of the things that Laura was just talking about was you know, checking your ego at the door and that sort of thing. And I have to guess that when you were at IBM, in a place where everybody is so IP knowledgeable and IP centric, and even at the CEO there was very engaged and understood IP, that you're operating there in a very different place and structure than in a lot of different organizations might be. Can you give us a sense and feel of how that compares to some of your other places that you've been at, like maybe a Verizon, where maybe it's not quite so steeped in the culture?
Yeah, so I think my most recent example was at Philips, and of course, reporting to the CEO was a luxury, and the other luxury was that it was a business unit, right? It was not at a separate P&L, which is very, very unusual for an IP organization. As Megan said, it's typically a cost center, right? You're looking at how do we shave costs, how do we limit the amount of exposure, all that. So it was a cultural mindset that we actually had that I enjoyed, being able to come in and talk to a C-suite that already appreciated what that value is. At Verizon, it was different because it was an organization that was small, and it was, they were trying to figure out what they should do, because Verizon, and even to some extent now, is a conglomerate of a lot of acquisitions, right? They made a lot of acquisitions over time. They had a lot of patents that they acquired through these acquisitions, and so they had a mishmash of patents. And the first thing I did when I got there was to try and do a characterization of that portfolio and prioritize it. So analytics was very important because you had to separate the wheat from the chaff. And so, that was important. And then reporting that to the C-suite and figuring out, okay, in my case, the CEO, trying to say, okay, this is what we've got. We've got these patents here that are core to our business, and that has to be very important to the organization. These patents over here, perhaps we can license out or sell or monetize in some way to return the investment back to the company. And here's some that are redundant. We've got, a ton of patents in the technology space. Perhaps there's more than what we need, and all of that. So there was a strategy element behind it. But from a cultural perspective, I think it's very important to make sure that companies are capturing the essence of the message to the CEO and the C-suite, that your goal is to capture innovation. Capturing innovation is so important. So how you're doing that is part of the stack that you're growing, whether it's patents, maybe some companies' patents aren't as strong, maybe it's software, maybe it's business methods, maybe it's know-how, maybe it's trade secrets. But the important thing is you're capturing the essence of that innovation, and you're showing what that means. And you're showing the direct correlation between that innovation and the revenue stream that you're generating. That's how you get the cultural breed established, because then you're showing the relevance to all the business units. You go out and you pay a visit to all the GMs of the business units. You're saying, you have revenue of 10 billion this past year. There's a direct correlation between our IP stack and what that revenue stream that supports. Or perhaps there's gaps because there's exposure, because we need to build that up to protect that revenue stream. Otherwise, there's risk that you're going to encounter by not having sufficient IP to support that revenue stream. So showing that direct correlation through the analytics and showing the relevance to every C-suite and every executive in the company is how you're gradually building up this base of support structure and getting that culture established.
Yeah. It all comes back to you have to talk to the people in a way that they can understand what it is that you're saying.
That's right.
And you have to treat them, I suppose, not only with respect, but I'm struggling to find a way to say it that isn't condescending, I suppose, because to us, Megan, it seems like, you and I, we talk about this a lot, because, you and I are very similar in that we're both data geeks, right? So we approach this a lot and looking at data, and we see these things. And when we start talking to people, we it glazes over their eyes, and,
right.
So you have to do this in a way that makes it such that it doesn't overpower them and shut them down, I guess.
Yeah, right. Like I think you can't overestimate how intimidated people are by the data. And actually, on that note, I wanted to surface a question from the audience to either Brian
Sure.
or Laura. Brian, you particularly mentioned, in conveying the importance is to convey the value of the asset somehow, and how you convey that value depends on who the person that you're talking to. Right. So finance is going to care the most about dollars. How much are we spending? Lawyers might care the most about risk. Somebody here asked, what does the CTO care about?
Yeah.
How do you convey the value of the asset to a CTO?
So the CTO is concerned about growing the R&D investment, right? So they're trying to say, okay, so I want to make sure maybe I'm spending 10% of the revenue for the company on R&D. I want to make sure I'm spending it in the right way, and I want to make sure that I'm protected along the way. So what you want to talk to the CTO is say, I want to get in the room right at the ideation session of when product development starts. If you can get me in that room, and here's the reason why it's important, is because you can define the design parameters of a product and create opportunities and also create risk mitigation. In other words, you're designing a product and you can say, well, the way that you're designing it now, I've done some landscaping on the IP, and so I know that my biggest competitor has patents that are already doing what you're trying to do. But if you tweak the design and sort of do it this way, you can avoid those problems, or you can create an opportunity because here's a gray space that they're not in. And so you're actually helping them in that design process, in the development process, in the whole R&D process. So that way you are helping to identify these gaps, is, you know, and so that way you're seizing the opportunity to patent in areas that other people do. And also add ways to preempt problems before they can happen, because the last thing he wants to see is that he spent $10 million designing a product and then you're going to come and tell him later on that there's a problem because there's patents, and he says, well, where were you, you know, 8 months ago or 2 years ago? This is how you can preempt those issues.
Yeah. So there was something that just popped in my, oh, Brian, when we had our meeting, our prep meeting, you had mentioned that when you were at IBM, I think you said you first reported to the general counsel, correct?
Well, yeah, there was a structure that was reporting to the general counsel, and we had there was a in the span of when I was leading the organization, we had shifted that to reporting to the essentially it was the CTO of the company, the guy that was in charge of the R&D. So I think it made a profound difference in the company, and the reason why I think it was important is because it allowed us to shift the focus away from a more conservative approach of treating everything as a legal decision versus a business decision. Because it's always been my intention that all IP decisions have a business component to it, and if that's the case, and once again, it depends on the company's structure. If you've got a small organization and you have just a small handful of patents, you know, maybe it makes sense to report to that to the general counsel structure. But for IBM, it was a big, you know, worldwide organization bringing in a lot of money, and you know, had a lot of exposure as well. And so we, you know, there was a conscious decision there to, you know, to structure it that way, and I think it made a fundamental impact in the company.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now Laura, let's come back to you, because I want to get to your last point here, the prepare a little bit more in detail, but I'd like to get you to react to what Brian was just talking about. And also, if you could tell us, within Polestar, where do you report? Where does your department fall within?
Yeah, currently reporting to the GC, but as we've had shift in management, I think that's a question of if that will shift. So Brian, I was very interested in hearing exactly how you made those changes and what those conversations looked like. So
yeah,
so
I made reference to your boss, Ray Millian, and Ray is actually Chief IP Counsel of Volvo, so he's your former boss, correct?
Yeah, exactly. He's my former boss. So, but learned a lot from him. But yeah, so now reporting into the GC, and doing a lot of, I think a lot of, they're raising a lot of questions about how this makes sense moving forward. And again, just doing that in parallel with the education of the management team of what IP could and maybe should or potentially could be doing for them. And I think that's where a lot of Brian's points about really connecting any IP decisions to the business is so necessary. And one more thing, Brian.
Well, and not to get into litigation strategy or anything like that, but there's a lot of litigation in your industry at the moment, right?
Yes, there is. Yes.
So it may make some sense, more so than in other spaces, to have you reporting to the general counsel for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Yeah. I think there are. I think there are good conversations, good arguments, both ways, for sure.
Yeah. So I think there's no one size fits all, and that maybe is another tip or trick if you're trying to figure out, well, because I'm always preaching that what you want to do is you want to look at successful people in successful corporations. And if you want to be successful, then you ought to think about trying to do what it is that they're doing. And this is one of those areas where, you know, you're going to have to do a survey and look at around to see, and you're not just going to be able to say, hey, you know, IBM has been successful for a very long period of time. Let's do it their way, because they have a distinct business model, and it's, you know, and it's distinct from Google, and but they're both huge tech companies making a lot of money, and Polestar is a sort of, you guys are, and we talked about this. You guys are, I don't know, I would call you a startup, but you sort of have the startup kind of, and I wrote down growing pains, and I think you corrected me in our call, and you said they're more like pivot pains. Can you explain that?
Yeah. I think what you were saying about the startup culture is very prevalent. And since we were spun out from Volvo Cars, it was oh, this is a fresh new company. Let's see what we can do here. So there's a lot of that excitement, and I think a little bit of a reaction to one of the, I think, things in big companies that folks are generally trying to avoid is all the processes, right? So we're working with that, but I think we're also realizing, wait, we're putting a very technologically complex, patent-heavy product out on the market globally, and so we don't have the benefit, or maybe the same challenges as a traditional startup, where you're having conversations about, is it time to move from a spreadsheet to something a little bit more complex, or a little bit more sophisticated, right? So I think it's been a really interesting journey, and I think internally, one of the fun things about it is it is always kind of changing. So growing pains potentially, but yeah, I think pivoting as we're defining and redefining where we want to be, and both in a business direction, but then also just how we're expanding globally. And then of course 2020 hit too, right? So then how all of that fits in has been yeah, really exciting, and I think required, last thing, and then I'll stop on this point, but has really required that integration between IP and business so much more. So yes, IP is reporting into GC and is very much a legal focused role in some ways, but also I think every single member of the team is really responsible for contributing to the business, or proving their value to the current and future business.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did that answer the question?
No, I think it did. Megan, do you have any questions, or is there any questions that we can pick off?
I think most people here, I'm seeing a lot of the questions about, again, how do you ascertain the value of a patent? And obviously that has to do with the audience. I will say, from what I've seen, the best measurements of value come from some combination of the public data out there and the private data that you have within your own company. So, at LexisNexis, we have a product called Patent Site that uses the Patent Asset Index to measure value. So it's a combination of how many times your patent was cited with how broad your market coverage is. And that's obviously incredibly valuable. When you combine that with something like Brian said, with what products that patent is also associated with, I think that's when it becomes really, really compelling. But yeah, I think, oh, go ahead, Brian.
From my perspective, I think, having that analysis is good, but, we're doing this, at Aon, and I've done it throughout my career in sort of a two-faced approach. You're looking at two different angles on value. You're looking at qualitative and quantitative, and most companies and most individuals really pay attention to the latter. They look at quantitative and looking at traditional market income and cost methods of valuing, and maybe throwing in some Black-Scholes analysis and all that kind of stuff, or discounted cash flow, which is great. But you're really ignoring the one of the key elements, which is really the qualitative piece. And the qualitative really has to do more with, is looking at, from a qualitative perspective, the IP that you've got, whether or not it's patents, we value trade secrets, and trademarks are the same way. You're looking at coverage aspect. You're looking at, does that IP, does those claims cover that revenue stream, or whatever it is, a business unit segment, whatever we're valuing, to what extent does that actually cover it? Because in a lot of cases, those claim elements might cover part of it, but not all of it. Maybe there's some aspects that are left uncovered. looking at the overall opportunity itself, and perhaps patent claims cover the intended use case, but also cover other use cases. So maybe the actual opportunity is broader than what you might think, because it might cover semiconductor process methodology, but also might cover other use cases that are unintended or unanticipated. Or perhaps it's narrower. So from a qualitative angle, looking at that. And then on the risk portion, really looking at what is the risk of invalidation, because it's in a patent class that's suspect when it comes to IPR challenges. So perhaps the file history has some warts on it because of some the way the office actions were prosecuted in the patent office, or perhaps there's a high risk of other bad things happening. So looking at that whole qualitative angle is just as important as the quantitative. But as I said on the outset, looking at that direct correlation to the revenue stream is most important, because you're looking at whether or not it's the revenue or whether or not it's for a cost savings. You're really looking at that direct correlation and looking at what that value is.
So, Brian, let me follow up on that, because, you know, when you say that the qualitative is as important, I think probably, you know, all of us in the IP world get that. You know, certainly in 2021, hopefully we all get that. Hopefully we are past the point where we think that this is a, you know, a game of global thermonuclear war where we're just counting warheads. But how do you, you know, as you always tell me, how do you make it relevant? How do you make that part relevant to somebody who, like the CFO, who, you know, the board is going to listen to the CFO, right? The CFO is one of those people who is going to have a substantial amount of time talking to the board, because the board needs to be apprised of the financial positions. And if you can get the CFO as your champion, then things are going to happen. But how do you get that CFO who is used to looking at these things in numbers and costs and expenses and risks and rewards to understand that, well, yes, this particular asset cost, you know, 10x, but it gives us 100x what this cheaper asset cost?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a matter of looking at, as I said earlier, separating the wheat from the chaff. As you and I both know, Gene, the statistic is pretty prevalent that if you've got a bucket of 1,000 patents, probably 1 to 3% of those are actually valuable, right? The others are, for whatever reason, aren't. And you can explain that. So then when you go to the CFO and you say, okay, I'm focusing on that 1 to 3%. I know what they are. I know, and they're valuable for these following reasons. Qualitatively, they're high quality assets, and here's how I'm valuing that quality. And you can bring in some of the either LexisNexis measurements or some of the analytics that we've got in being able to look at, okay, we've looked at the cost of maintaining these things, but the cost and quality trade-off, right? So making sure that the things that we're spending our money on are very high quality. And here's the direct correlation between that revenue stream that we've got. And this is the reason why we need to continue to grow that portfolio, because we've identified the following gaps. That creates more risk, creates more of perhaps a detrimental cost that we'll have to do in litigation or defending ourselves in suit. And so that makes it relevant to a CFO. So as I say, you have the audience and you're making that relevant, but those analytics are super important, you know, to dummy that down, not dumbing it down, but putting it in a format that a CFO can readily understand very, very quickly.
Yeah. So, and
yeah,
I want to,
and Gene,
hold on, let me just to interrupt you 1 second. I just want to let folks know why Brian and I, we keep talking about the CFO, because in previous conversations, one of the things Brian opened my eyes to is, you know, so many of us talk about, well, how do I get the CEO to understand this? And Brian said, well, you know, you're far more likely to get time to talk to the CFO than you are to the CEO. And the CFO is always in the boardroom, you know, this right by the CEO's arm. So if you can't get to the CEO and it's easier to get to the CFO, you need to start taking language lessons, you know, English to CFO dictionary or something like that, right, Brian?
That's right. And that's the champion, you know, finding somebody, whether it's the CFO, whether it's one of the largest GMs of the largest business unit, you know, getting somebody that can actually be a helpful voice for you when they have these C-suite meetings.
Yeah. Okay, Megan, I just wanted to lay that foundation, but go
yeah.
ahead.
No, I think that is really interesting. But the other thing I wanted to mention about Brian's point, so if Gene, if you can show slide 19 real quick, it's kind of a perfect example of what Brian was just talking about, of demonstrating quality. So I picked this example from the automotive industry, picking on Laura. So what this is showing is, various technology types that are existing in the automotive industry right now, and it's divided up mostly based on CPC and IPC codes here. Interestingly, the first thing you notice, by the way, is that most of the patents these days have to do with alternative energy types or digital things. Internal combustion engines, ICE, are actually a smaller section. But here's what I think is really interesting about this. So this is a breakdown of how many patents have protection in each country right now. On the left-hand side, it's just how many, right? So like the blue dot in the upper left-hand corner, that's how many autonomous driving patents exist in the US right now. The right-hand side is a measure of value. This is one of the quantitative measures of value, like Brian referenced. So this is the patent asset index. So it's how much market coverage and how many citations are these patents.
I'm not sure I'm looking at the right one. Which one are you? Which one are you want me to look at?
Oh, sorry. Go to the next. Go to the next one. There, that one's by company. The next one is by country. Yep, there you go.
There we go. Okay.
Oh no, one back, one up. The dots with the
all right,
countries
that's what
on
I
them.
thought. Okay. Yep. Here we go.
Nope, not quite. Maybe I have a different deck than you do, but I think it should be number 19.
Yeah, the 19 that I have is this one here.
Go one down, because that says 18 on the bottom corner. Weird. It's almost like you're there. It is. There's the one.
Okay. All right. So
that one.
All right. Yeah. Okay.
So left-hand side is just how many patents per country in each of these fields, and the right-hand side is one of these is our quantitative measure of value. And I think what jumps out here is, look, China's got a ton of patents in a lot of these spaces, but when you see the value, you can see it really, really shrinks down. So I just wanted to surface this as kind of an example of what Brian was saying. Like you have to speak to people in a language that matters to them, and sometimes it's not just about how many, it's about how valuable they are. So.
Okay, now in my defense, so people don't think I can't count, I was looking at on my deck here. It says, although it says slide 19 on it, and I should be able to know that. I'm using something that says this is slide 20 because it's counting the first deck. So I apologize.
I'm sure we were all worried, Gene.
Nobody questions
I
your
know.
math.
Look, hey, you have no idea the criticisms that I can get.
I believe it. Hey, but if I can jump in here.
Sure, absolutely.
Quickly, comment, Megan and Brian, what you were saying, and I think my third point, which was prepare 3 times, is because for me, at least in my current position, I'm really telling a story, right? I'm telling a story to all these different folks, and I'm figuring out who it's worth to, like to Brian's point, or in what you were saying, Gene, if you can't get the CEO, talk to the CFO, figuring out who it's worth telling this story to, right? Or telling this story to and tailoring it. And for me, these first 2 points are kind of setting the stage and the filler, but really the heart of the story is based on this data. So part of it is just constantly consuming as much of the publicly available data as I can, but then also reaching out to folks who can give me specialized data specific to my industry or just our company in particular, so I can pull on those pieces in the conversations, in the different stories that I'm telling the different players and relevant stakeholders, and having that at my fingertips. And I think that for me is why, I know we started with data and I haven't really talked about it. I've talked about all the human pieces, but that's because for me, I rely so heavily on external sources to provide me with the data, and then that I can pull as relevant, but within the context of the story. The story can't be the data, but the story really has to be centered around the data. I think has been, my experience, and why prepare is on there 3 times, because it's really, you can't just be getting, at least in my experience, you can't be just getting the information. You really have to be able to have it as a tool that you can work with and play with in whatever conversations. And that's where I think Megan and Brian's work is so incredibly valuable and necessary to what I'm trying to do right now. And I think what folks are trying to do.
Sure.
Okay,
So
back to
now
you.
I have got a number of questions here that some of which we've already kind of addressed here. The one that I think is really interesting that I would like to hear both of you talk about is what type of information do you think you need to be bringing to either the C-suite or to the board, and why? I mean, and I guess the way I'm envisioning that is there's a whole lot of things that don't rise to that level that, you know, like if you were to bring it to them, they're like, well, isn't this what I'm paying you for?
Yeah.
And then there's a whole lot of things that you really need to bring to their attention. And what is the difference and how do you make that determination? Brian, start with you.
Well, I would think I'm at a very strategic level. So at Philips, for instance, we inserted ourselves as part of the strategic plan process, so that they have a strategic plan on record that they update every year. We are in the room, and the thing you want to bring in is by business unit. So you have a strategic plan, an IP strategy, I should say, from a company-wide perspective that you communicate. But then you bust it up and bring a chapter for each business unit that's part of the organization. So in Philips, it was roughly, I don't know, maybe 20 different sub-business units. Each one had their own distinct IP strategy that rolled up into an overall corporate IP strategy. So the information you're bringing in is, okay, so what in that strategic plan on record, you're bringing it up. Here's the portfolio you have. This is what we're doing. This is how much we're spending. Here's the ROI that we're getting from that investment. So how much IP are we generating? How much innovation are we capturing? In my case, how much licensing you're bringing in? What are the costs of litigation that's incurred during that period, and what are we doing to mitigate that? What is our longer term strategy in growing that portfolio to protect the business, to protect the revenue stream? All of these things have impact, direct impact to the company on the finances, as well as to the strategy of, you know, product development, revenue development, and overall strategy for the company. So I think that's the information that I always brought in at a quarterly and also an annual basis.
Okay, so strategy and finances. Laura, I mean, in your case, where you're in an industry that is formerly a mature industry, now really an immature industry with a lot of litigation, I would guess that you would be tending towards the risk, correct?
Yeah, yes, definitely. Again, depending on what the conversation is, and I think that for me now is one of the most interesting pieces, right, to folks in the boardroom. So starting with that and really sharing, that's where external data is really important, just really doing some benchmarking and letting folks know where we're at and what we're looking at and what everyone else is looking at. From the outside, I think that both at a company in the industry that I'm in now, but also at a company the size that I'm in with very ambitious IP goals, I think that starting with risk is such an important piece. But then also, similar to Brian, though much more or much less complex, I'm sure, bringing in your IP strategy, right, and showing them, hey, this is what we've got and this is what we're doing. But then also, and again, I think this is in part because of the industry and in part because of the company, bringing in always different options, right? So really letting it be an integral to the business and letting folks understand, or trying to help folks understand what we're doing and why we're doing it and where we can go from here and what the different investments might look like for the different goals that they've either had or talked about or have heard from our CFO, who's fully aligned. So I think, yeah, I think very similar in some ways to Brian, but also really focusing on risk and then seeing where the conversation goes. I think, yeah, so a combination of really leading with an agenda, but then also being open, and that's where having all of this data available to you is really helpful, because really being open to what is of interest or what is most crucial for the players in the room on that particular day or that particular quarter, I think Yeah.
So questions number 2 and 3 start to get us into data, I suppose, although I didn't put data in there. And I guess what I was trying to get at is, how do you quickly convey this? And do you come, I suppose, I mean, if it were me, I guess what I would be thinking about doing would be coming with the data in forms of charts and that sort of thing, and having it at the ready, and to be able to answer questions quickly. But do you lead with that? Do you lead with the story? Do you then supply the data to answer the questions that they have? Do you try and anticipate the questions that they have and answer them? How do you set up the time that you're given, Brian?
Yeah, so I think at a high level, you have to state, what the overall message is, why, and make it impactful. So you want to state what it is that you're trying to convey, and then you have the supporting analytics around it. And that's everywhere from what's currently going on within the company from an IP angle, and what you're doing to protect the company, as well as creating opportunities to leverage through capturing more revenue, through avoiding costs, through avoiding litigation. And then you want to show how you're, and this is important too, is showing how you're affected by your competition, because they're super interested. That'll get their attention, because you're saying, you're anticipating what your largest competitors are doing, and maybe you're doing cross licensing to mitigate that, or maybe you're doing Mexican standoff because that's the strategy that you're employing. But you've thought about how you're addressing competition, because they're thinking about it from their perspective, from revenue, right? They're trying to figure out how they can capture more market share. And what you're trying to is going a step further and saying, okay, you can enable that market share because you've got exclusivity in the marketplace. You've got premium profits that you can charge that they can't, because you've got a portfolio that protects that investment. So then you're showing that relevance, and trying to, every discussion that they're having, you want to make sure that you're showing the IP perspective of that same discussion.
Yeah. So now, Laura, how do you, let's go down to question number 4, just in the interest of time. When you're providing counsel, what is your strategy to make sure that the IP strategy matches the business focus? I mean, particularly, that's got to be interesting with Polestar, because it is a new area which is evolving, and I don't think we know exactly what that industry is going to look like in 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, exactly. And I think at Polestar especially, that's where you really feel the startup mentality, that folks we're moving fast on business goals. And so the short answer is iterate. So checking in, staying looped in with the business. And that's where, again, I hate to have emphasized so many of the soft skills here, but really relationship building and making sure that folks know that you aren't there to waste their time, and you are there to add value, and proving that consistently, and that it's not going to be an unpleasant conversation, or they're going to be reprimanded, or all the things that they normally expect with or often expect with lawyers, I should say. So the short version is iterate, and then how you do that, I think, is a much more on the personal level, how you stay making sure that you are invited to the meetings that you need to be invited to, right? And there's a flow of information in both directions, or often several directions, just pretty consistently. Brian, sorry, go ahead.
And I suppose it's the soft skills that you have to have relationships if you are like, and I just threw this in there, number 5 is like, well, what do you do if you really think they're about to make a big mistake? And I suppose if you have relationships, and you've built those relationships, and you have credibility, you might have the ability to say, I really think you need to rethink this. Whereas if you don't have credibility, you've never put any capital into the soft skills, then you don't have those abilities, I suppose, right, Brian?
Yeah, that's when a relationship is very important, to have that candid relationship with whomever you're speaking with. If it's a CFO or even the CEO, I would have these same discussions with him, and just call him up on the phone and say, this is what I'm thinking. And here's the pros and cons of the approach that the company wants to take. Just want to make sure you're aware that it could lead down to this path. And so, I mean, you can make whatever decision you like, but the advice and counsel that you're providing is important to be able to support him. And you know, and often they're appreciative because they didn't think about it from that perspective, and it may cause them to rethink it. But you want to have that sort of one-on-one versus in a group setting, because then you don't want to embarrass folks, but at the same time pointing out some of the challenges.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember the one thing that comes to mind there, it's not related to IP in the boardroom, but years ago I heard a story about where very well-respected litigator told a judge who had said that they were going to make a ruling in a patent case from the bench in a certain way. The counsel stood up and says, Your Honor, can before you make that ruling, can I approach? And when he approached, he said, Judge, we need to go back in chambers. He says, you can't make that ruling. If you make that ruling, the Federal Circuit's going to reverse you, and they're probably going to make an example of you. You know, and because that person was, you know, a well-respected litigator, the judge did adjourn. They went back into the into chambers, and the judge said, "Okay, explain this to me one more time." You know, and they got it right, and it was a black and white issue that, you know, it was going to be reversed. But if you don't have credibility, you can't do those types of things.
Yeah.
So, all right, Megan, we're at the hour here, but are there questions that you have? Are there slides that you want to talk about here to wrap things up, or?
No, I would just encourage our audience to look through some of the slides so you can see examples of the types of intel that you can get from the data. You know, it's like we started off at the beginning. There is an obscene amount of data that's out there right now, and patent data in particular is very complex, and there are a lot of subtleties to it. And that's a beautiful thing from our perspective, right? Because I love to spend all day engaging with that. But it can be really tricky when you're trying to get something meaningful out of it. I mean, I've worked with people, we've gone through 10 to 12 revisions of the same slide before they present it to their CEO, to their CFO, and every version was correct. Every single version had correct data, accurate data, but it was only the last version that had the data that they really needed to see.
Yeah, or in some cases that they wanted them to see. I remember I think we did a webinar with Ray Haggerty. This has got to be over a year ago, maybe, and we showed a slide, and he's like, "Well, that's a slide that if you ever showed to the board, that would be very career limiting."
Yeah. Well, know your audience again.
So you got to
know your audience.
But you got to know your data too, because, you know, sometimes in your data is telling you a story that you need to hear, and if you don't hear it, then you are going to be career limited. But that's a different story for a different day. What I'd still like to do is I'd like to give everybody an opportunity to, in rapid fire, if you want, to give me your final thought. Laura, let's start with you. What is the one thing that you hope people leave today remembering?
Show up, talking. I'm going to try and put it all in one sentence. Ooh.
Sure.
Show up, talking to folks like they're humans, but like you're the expert. So showing up and really coming with the data that they want to hear, that's interesting to them, that addresses their pain points, and starting from there and then moving to the agenda that you need them to know.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. Brian, your takeaway message.
Yeah, just make your message very impactful, make it direct, and make it, you know your audience, know who you're speaking with, and make your message relate to them in a way that they can understand.
Great, thanks, Brian. And Megan, your final thought here today.
Yeah, just to kind of reiterate what I said a minute ago, know what's out there in terms of data. There were a lot of questions about how you assess the value of a patent. How do you convey that value to people? And even I'm surprised when I look at the data that's out there and all the options for expressing value. So try to be aware of what's there.
Yeah, that's a different story for a different day, and we will come back to actually how you can value patents. Patent Site's got some great ways to do that by taking a look at the quality of the assets themselves, which is certainly one way. Today was about how do you convey information to those people in the boardroom and the C-suite, which really fundamentally is all about relationships and credibility and giving people the information that they need, and realizing, I think my takeaway message is a lot of the time, probably far more often than not, you're not going to be at a place like an IBM where the entire culture from the ground up is IP centric, and even the CEO gets it and understands it to a very good level. You're likely going to be at a place where they don't understand it. And it's not because they don't want to understand it. It's just that that's not how they grew up in the industry that they were in. So you have to understand who they are and where they're at, just like you would a client that would come to you off the street. So you have to start educating them. You can't start with the PhD explanation before you start with the BS explanation, and that probably doesn't sound right when I just said it like that. It's not the BS explanation, but it's the Bachelor of Science explanation. But I got down that path, and as I was about to say it, I thought to myself, "Oh my God, I'm going to end with a BS explanation." But hopefully you all got what I was trying to say. So, Anne, I see you turn on your camera. Do you have anything you would like to add?
Oh, I just wanted to thanks everyone for joining us today. That was really insightful and also useful for me when I want to speak with people, because this is something that IP professionals come often to me with questions like, "Oh yeah, that's really nice. I really enjoy the data and the software and all those kind of things, but what can I do with it?" So I would recommend them to watch this webinar also.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
For them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Well, you have a good rest of your day wherever you may be, and we hope to see you again in the future. But for now, that's all we have. So take care and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.